Okay, thank you for joining us. This is the second video in the series that I'm putting together on Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. In this extract, we encounter two of the other key characters within the novel, Scrooge's nephew Fred and his clerk Bob Cratchit. So, as with the previous video, I'm going to be reading through the text to you, pausing to reflect on some of the most important quotations within this extract and considering how Dickens uses language to present these two supporting characters. So, let's begin. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore, the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. Okay, so let's have a look then at some of the key sections of this part of the text. Let's have a look at how Dickens uses language to portray the world outside Scrooge's office. So let's look first of all at the way that Dickens opens this part of the text. Once upon a time. Now, we've touched upon the fact that this novella in some ways uses the conventions of the fairy tale genre. We see a bad man turned good over the course of a single night, and this story takes place on Christmas Eve and on the night before Christmas. So it really does use some of the conventions of that fairy tale style, most notably here in that phrase, once upon a time. We see the fact that on Christmas Eve, on the brink of this major holiday, Scrooge is sat in his counting house, and he isn't alone. He's forcing his clerk to work on Christmas Eve as well. So, let's look at the way that Dickens presents the weather here then and how he sets the scene. So it's cold, bleak, biting weather. The outside world is being presented as harsh and inhospitable. And it's so foggy that he can barely see outside. He can hear people walking up and down and stamping their feet on the pavement stones to try and keep themselves warm. But it's already starting to get dark. And I really love the use of this language here. The houses opposite were mere phantoms. So the fog that's pouring in off the streets, and we associate, in the Victorian era, we associate London with this constant sort of suffocating smog, this fog that disguises and conceals everything. This fog is so thick that the houses on the opposite side of the street are described as mere phantoms, and this word is so carefully chosen. On one level, Dickens is suggesting that the houses look like they're hard to see. You can barely get a glimpse of them through this fog, so they're these barely perceptible shapes. But at the same time, that word phantom obviously means ghosts. And he's just reminding us, don't forget, Marley's ghost. That's what this chapter is about. We're about to see this ghostly apparition. So we have this slightly supernatural atmosphere and setting being developed as well, the dark that's creeping in early. And then we move on to meet Bob Cratchit, who is going to be a major secondary character within the novel, and who here is forced to work just next to Scrooge's office in a dismal little cell. And the door of Scrooge's counting house is open so that he can watch Bob, so that he can keep his eye on him. And this really suggests that lack of trust that Scrooge has in his fellow man. He doesn't trust Bob Cratchit, who's there working for him on Christmas Eve. He suspects perhaps that he's not going to be working hard enough. And he keeps him in a dismal little cell. And this is such a brilliant little description here. Dismal conveying that gloomy, sombre atmosphere, and cell being evocative of a prison. So Bob Cratchit is forced to work under Scrooge's close supervision. Scrooge doesn't trust him, and he's kept in these conditions that are really like a jail cell. Really harsh, really inhospitable, an awful kind of environment for him to be working in. So we see Scrooge's lack of care for his employees. And this is one of the relationships that's going to come to be particularly important and particularly prominent within the novel. And we see how cruelly and how carelessly he treats Bob at the beginning of the text. In the next highlighted section here, Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. Really is a very simple evocation of Scrooge's lack of generosity. He doesn't let Bob have a proper fire, even though it's bitterly cold outside. He has a slightly larger one for himself. So again, we see that selfishness, we see that lack of care for those people working for him, and we see that cruelty. Not only that, though, he's not even allowed to top up his fire because Scrooge keeps the coal box in his own room, and when Bob comes in with the shovel to go and get some more coal for his fire, Scrooge takes it from him. So at that point, Bob is forced to put on his white comforter and he tries to warm himself at the candle, and we get the impression of this pitiful little flame flickering away that he's trying to warm his hands at. So we see the selfishness, we see the cruelty there of Scrooge and how carelessly and how unkindly he treats this man who's working for him. So into this dismal, cold, mean little scene walks Scrooge's nephew, Fred, who is the absolute embodiment of everything that is good and kind and wonderful about Christmas. And from his very first words, we see that he is the absolute opposite to Scrooge in his attitudes, in the way that he interacts with other people. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas? Humbug, Uncle!" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "humbug." "Oh, don't be cross, Uncle," said the nephew. Okay, so this is Scrooge's nephew, Fred, and let's just have a look at the contrasts that Dickens brings out here between Fred and Scrooge, because we see straight away how different these two characters are, despite the fact that they are family. So the very first things that Fred says are "Merry Christmas" and "God save you." We see here that he's a contrast to his uncle in every way. He's festive, so he celebrates Christmas. He's full of the joys of the Christmas season. Not only that, but he's overtly Christian in his attitudes. He says, "God save you." So he references God immediately. He associates Christmas with Christianity, with faith, with religion. And unlike Scrooge, described as we saw in that first section of the text as a covetous old sinner, Fred is clearly Christian and clearly a man of faith. He's a good moral person. Not only that, he's obviously cheerful. This is described in the way that his voice sounds. Cried gives the sense of an outgoing and carefree nature. He doesn't mutter, he doesn't say, he cries it out, he shouts it out. So he's bursting in through the doors of this miserable counting house, and he's full of happiness and warmth and Christmas cheer. So we see that contrast brought out straight away, and this contrast gets developed across the course of these two men's conversation. So Scrooge rejects Fred's kindness immediately. He says, "Bah, humbug," one of these incredibly famous lines we associate with this character. Humbug means nonsense, so Scrooge is immediately dismissive of Fred's greetings. He thinks that Christmas is nonsense, celebrating Christmas is for idiots. So we see his cynicism coming out here, his complete lack of respect for the Christmas season, and his impression that actually Christmas isn't worth celebrating. Next, we see a little bit more of a physical description of Fred. And think about the ways in which Scrooge was described as being cold. In the previous extract, he carries this coldness within him, and he's compared to the rain and the snow and the bitter biting wind. So Scrooge's cruelty and his callousness and his miserable nature are continually aligned with coldness. Fred is the opposite. So everything about Fred exudes warmth and heat and happiness. So, he had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost. So just as Dickens aligns Scrooge with coldness, he connects him to things that are cold, he aligns Fred with warmth. In their first appearance, he glows. So he's associated with this warmth and this kindness. So he is the contrast to Scrooge's coldness. He was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. So we get that sense that his goodness is almost shining out of him. More contrast here are being developed with his uncle, with Scrooge. Fred seems healthy, he's all in a glow, his face is ruddy, so his cheeks are pink from walking outside in the cold. He seems lively, he seems attractive, and his eyes sparkled. It's almost as though this goodness comes out in his physical appearance. He's lively, he's happy, he's positive, and it makes him seem warm. So immediately we have a more positive impression of Fred. We see that Scrooge's miserable nature hasn't been something that's been brought about by his family. So this is something that seems to be quite unique to him. And we get more curious about what it is that has made him this way and how he's come to be in this cynical, miserable frame of mind when he thinks about the world. Let's carry on. So, Scrooge says, "What right have you to be merry? You're poor enough." And this makes us think that for Scrooge, happiness is something that has to be earned, like money. You can't simply be happy. What have you done to get it? He can't imagine that anyone would be joyful, anyone could be cheerful, anyone could be happy without money. So for him, money and wealth is the be-all and end-all. It's his reason to exist. It's his reason for being. Fred, on the other hand, is happy simply because he is happy. He is a positive person. And we see the very different perspectives that these men have here about the world. Fred quickly switches and reverses his uncle's logic and says, "What right have you to be dismal? What right have you to be morose? You're rich enough." So he claims that Scrooge is so rich he shouldn't be miserable. By Scrooge's own logic, if money makes you happy, he should be happy. So by contrasting these viewpoints, Dickens points out the foolishness and the short-sightedness of Scrooge's attitude towards the world. Wealth isn't the thing that brings you happiness. Kindness and love and family and all of those things that are associated within the novel with Christmas, those are the things that make a person's life worth living. It's how you treat the people around you and the relationships that you build with them. And we see Scrooge's attitude and his way of living thus far seems to have made him cold and miserable. But in this novel, this is what must change for Scrooge. Okay, so let's continue reading. Scrooge isn't able to think of anything to say to Fred to respond, and Fred ends up saying, "Don't be cross, uncle." "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas! Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you? If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it." So, immediately here then, Dickens presents a little bit more of a glimpse into Scrooge's worldview. He thinks he lives in a world of fools, so he has no respect. That's not going to appear, is it? No. He has no respect for other people in the world with him. And he sees them as really being unworthy of his respect. He dismisses them as fools. He sees himself as being surrounded by idiots. And this again makes him seem isolated, but it also makes him quite unsympathetic. How can we expect to feel sorry for someone when they have such a negative view of everyone around them? He looks at Christmas as a time for finding himself a year older but not an hour richer. So he sees it as a time for reflecting on everything that you haven't managed to do during the year. And this is interesting because we typically think of Christmas as a time for being thankful, a time for being grateful for what we do have, a time for reflecting upon, all of the positive aspects of our lives. So Scrooge views Christmas as a time of reflection on what one doesn't have rather than on what one does. He doesn't see the value of Christmas as a time for family, for kindness, for thankfulness, for love, and these are all of the things that Dickens wants us to associate with Christmas. So he has this very rude, very crude sort of attitude to the way that other people celebrate Christmas, and he says every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding. So he wishes anyone that was so cheerful all the time would be dead, basically. And Fred is quite upset by this, having obviously just come in and wished his uncle a very Merry Christmas. But Scrooge quite simply tells him, "Let me get on with my life. Stop trying to change me." So, let's continue. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it," repeated Scrooge's nephew, "but you don't keep it. You don't celebrate it." "Let me leave it alone then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "Well, there are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew, "Christmas among the rest. But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time. A kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year, when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow creatures, fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever. "And let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." So, in this speech of Fred's then at the beginning of the novel, Dickens explains to his readers and establishes the function of Christmas within the novel and how he sees Christmas as providing a really important celebration for society. So, Fred quite clearly says, "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited," meaning there are plenty of things which are good for me, even if they don't make me rich. And for Scrooge, anything that does you good must be something that you're getting money from. So, nephew. So Fred is explaining that there's plenty of things that are good for you, even if they don't make you financially better off. And he says Christmas is one of them. And just look at this description of how he sees Christmas. It is a fundamentally good time. It is a basically good thing. It is kind, forgiving, charitable, and pleasant. And these are the key things that Scrooge lacks, the key qualities that he doesn't have. He's not pleasant, he's not kind, he's unforgiving, and he is far from charitable. So these are all of the qualities that he could learn from Christmas, ways in which he could change that would make him a better person. And Dickens presents these really clearly right at the beginning of the novel. Also, just as a little note on your context, your AO3, and there's a note there for you to scribble down if this is going to be useful to you. In the Victorian era, interesting Christmas traditions was being revived among the middle classes. So interesting Christmas trees, in Christmas meals, Christmas pudding, all of these kind of things was being revived and made a sort of major part of a middle class year. These were parts of the celebration that they would have had, and this wasn't something that had been the case in previous years, in previous eras. So this interest in Christmas traditions and this focus on the goodness and the celebratory aspects of this season are reflected in Fred, whom Dickens uses to present the joys of Christmas. So Fred is the embodiment of this kind of middle class, positive, joyful attitude towards this time of year. So, notice as well that Fred comments on Christmas as being a time when men and women seem to open their shut-up hearts freely. And just remember Scrooge being depicted as this closed, tight-fisted, solitary oyster of a man. This is foreshadowing what will happen to Scrooge later in the novella. Eventually, he will open his shut-up heart as well. He's been so closed off to everyone thus far in his life. When he opens his heart, we see how he is transformed. So, he ends his speech by noticing that at Christmas time, men and women don't think of people below them as anything other than fellow passengers to the grave. So he's saying that at Christmas time, class distinctions disappear. People in the upper classes don't look down on those in poverty or those people who have less than them. They don't dismiss them. They don't show a lack of respect for them. They recognise them as their fellow man, their fellow human being. So it's a time in which all humanity is united. So he ends by saying, "It's never made me richer, it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, but it has done me good and it will do me good. And I say, God bless it." And this little speech causes Bob Cratchit to burst out into applause, the clerk in the tank, so in his little tiny room tucked away next to Scrooge's office. But he becomes immediately sensible, he becomes immediately aware of the impropriety. He suddenly realises he's behaved in a way that won't be appreciated, an improper way. And Scrooge quite quickly reacts, "Let me hear another sound from you and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." So we see his callousness again, his insensitivity and his cruelty, because in that moment he's threatening to fire Bob Cratchit for applauding Fred's speech. So when Bob goes to celebrate with Fred, Scrooge simply threatens to throw him out, which just shows how casually cruel he can be. Okay, so let's continue. Fred has invited Scrooge to dinner, and Scrooge responds. Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. So essentially he's saying he'll see Fred in hell. He'll see him in that extremity. So essentially, I'll be dead before I come to dinner with you. So he rejects his family member. He pushes his nephew away. "But why?" cried Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only one thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We've never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge, "and a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." Okay, and that is the end of our extract for today. So, just looking at this conversation then between Scrooge and Fred. Scrooge is seen as rejecting and pushing away his family, choosing instead to continue his life of isolation. And Fred can't understand why Scrooge doesn't want to come to see him. Scrooge says, "Why did you get married?" Perhaps implying here, "You have a wife, why do you need me for company?" And Fred says, "Well, because I fell in love." So again, we see Fred's sort of simple earnestness here. He's not trying to be particularly quick or clever, he's just being quite honest. "I got married because I fell in love." But Scrooge seems to look at this again with that cynical attitude, and he seems to think that love is ridiculous. The way he says it with a growl suggests that he has no respect for this. So this is really the first hint at maybe what has caused Scrooge to withdraw from the world. We wonder what has made him so disdainful, so dismissive of the idea of love, because here he appears to be disgusted or angered by the very mention of the word. And we wonder whether perhaps this is something that Scrooge in his own life lacks. His nephew seems to be cheerful and open to a friendly relationship with him, but he doesn't seem to have someone in his life that he loves, and we'll learn more about what has led him to this point later in the novel. So, continuing, Fred says, well, you can hardly give that as an excuse for not coming to see me. You never came to see me before I got married. But Scrooge, by this point, is just continuing, every time he says good afternoon, continuing to dismiss him. And this is really a way of telling him it's time for you to go. And you see he starts by simply saying good afternoon, but as we go on, we see the use of the exclamation mark there, suggesting that he's saying it with increasing frustration and irritation, as we have these exclamatives down at the bottom here in the second to last and the final good afternoon. Fred can't understand why Scrooge doesn't want him around. He says, I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. I don't know why you're being so stubborn in turning me away. And he says, we've never had an argument. I don't understand why you would treat me this way. But he says, I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So even being turned away by Scrooge doesn't cause him to become cruel in response. He remains cheerful, he remains positive, he remains kind in the way that he speaks to Scrooge, even as he's leaving, having been so harshly spoken to. His last words to him are, a Merry Christmas, Uncle, and a Happy New Year. So, Fred repeatedly attempts to be cheerful and kind to Scrooge, but Scrooge's response is to just dismiss him. Good afternoon is that instruction for him to leave. On the way out, an interesting thing happens, which is, as Fred leaves, without an angry word, despite everything, he stops to say Merry Christmas to the clerk. That's Bob Cratchit, not that he's been named yet. And even though Bob is freezing cold with his tiny little fire that he's just poked out, he is still warmer than Scrooge, for he returns them cordially, meaning he responds kindly and pleasantly to Fred's Merry Christmas. Lastly, just look at the way that Scrooge reacts to this. Sitting alone in his office, he mutters to himself that he doesn't understand Bob's reaction. My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. So, Scrooge can't understand how Bob could be happy about Christmas given the fact that he only earns 15 shillings a week and the fact that he has a family to support as well. He doesn't make this connection between Bob's poor condition, between the fact that he is in such a difficult set of circumstances, with the fact that he himself pays Bob so badly. If he wanted Bob's life to be better, he could simply pay him more and help him to support his family, but he doesn't. Instead, he pays him badly and wonders why on earth Bob has any kindness left in him. So not only does Scrooge have this miserable attitude in his own life, in his own perspective, but he can't understand why more people don't see the world as negatively as he does. And obviously, what he lacks are some of the things that we later learn that Fred and that Bob both have: loving, close families. And we start to see some of the circumstances in Scrooge's life that have led him to see the world in such a cold, hard-hearted way. Okay, I hope that that's been a useful overview of these next two characters as they've been introduced in the text, Bob Cratchit and Fred. They're going to be really important characters within the text, so I know that this is a lot of detail for this second video, but hopefully it's given you a really good understanding of how these characters are presented in contrast to Scrooge, so that as we go on and we learn more about them, you'll see some similar use of language repeating and some similar themes and contextual points being repeated as well. Alright, thanks very much for your time today, and I hope that this was useful to you. We carry on next time with Scrooge's interaction with some charity workers, and we'll be looking closely at how that relates to Dickens's key message within the novel related to poverty, charity and kindness. Alright, thanks very much. Bye bye for now.